Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of the Memoirs of General Rapp. Chapter 43.
The season became every day more severe. The rains were incessant and produced a fetid fog which the sun, without heat, could scarcely dissipate. But what was still worse, the scarcity still continued to increase. Horses, dogs, cats were eaten. We had exhausted all our resources. Our salt even failed us. It is true that industry supplied the deficiency. Some soldiers conceived the idea of boiling some old planks which had formerly belonged to a storehouse. The trial succeeded. We sprung this new mine, and the hospitals were supplied. The population was reduced to the last extremity. It lived on nothing but malt and bran, and it had not even enough of these to satisfy its wants. In this state of distress, I thought the philanthropic allies would not repulse their fellow countrymen. I drove out of the fortress the prisoners and the beggars, all, in a word, who had no provisions. But the Prussians were inexorable, and, but for the inhabitants of St. Albrecht, they would have left them to perish from want. Others went to the quarters occupied by the Russians, and were not better received. Without shelter, without food of any kind, they would have perished under the eyes of these liberators of humanity, if I had not taken pity on their wretchedness. I gave them some relief, and sent them to their homes. Several begged to be employed in the fortifications, and they received half or a quarter of a loaf of ammunition bread for their wages. In the meantime, the enemy had completed their works. From time to time they tried their batteries, and seemed to perform a prelude to a more serious action. On the 10th, accordingly, they all began to fire towards the close of the day. The town, the home, the entrenched camp of Neufahrwasser are inundated with shells, grenades, and red-hot balls. The fire breaks forth and consumes the convent of the Dominicans. The Russian prisoners who were kept in the building were on the point of perishing when our soldiers rushed in and saved them from death. The flames, continuing to increase in violence, wreathed round the neighboring houses and threatened to reduce them to ashes. At the same time, the Allies presented themselves in strength before our posts of Ora and drove them back as far as Stadtgebiet. I came up with Count Heudelet. The enemy, overthrown at the point of the bayonet, attempted in vain to return to the charge. General Husin and Major Legro repulsed all their attacks. A mistake augmented their losses. 2 of their columns took each other for the enemy and engaged accordingly. They recognized their friends by the cries of the wounded, but more than 300 men were already laid in the dust. On our side, we had 100 hors de combat. Early the next day, the enemy appeared before the houses beyond Stadtgebiet. Driven back twice, he set fire to them. Although twice wounded, Captain Bassett was unwilling to give them up, but it was not long before the progress of the flames compelled him. He retired, fighting all the way. The Allies, being masters of the village, pushed on, without halting, to the level of the Étoile, and took it. The posts which remained on the descent of the hill were henceforth too weak, and I called them in. The enemy at last took possession of this position, but he paid sufficiently dear for a mere embankment of earth. The farther he advanced towards Langfort, the more perilous his situation became. Taken in flank and in rear, thundered on by the batteries of the home, he was soon unable to debouch from the redoubts he had raised at Kabrun. Confused at having mistaken the true point of attack, he concentrated his forces and marched on the heights of Ora. He tried every means to get possession of them, and I neglected none to defend them. I improved, I extended my works. I made everyone contribute his skill and information. Superior officers of each department of the army, under the presidency of General Grandjean, consulted on the measures which the security of the place required. They put our provisions and our ammunition out of the reach of the ravages of fire. They portion out the provisions and organize the engine department and get mills in readiness, so that if the shells should destroy what we already possessed, there were others to supply their loss. In the meantime, the Allies continued their bombardment. Fire succeeded fire and threatened to reduce everything to ashes. On a sudden, the batteries ceased. The firing was suspended. At this unexpected silence, the inhabitants resumed their courage. They ran. They fled to the relief of the quarters that were on fire. Poor people, There was nothing to save from the flames but a few walls. The place was on the brink of its ruin. The enemy had only stopped the firing in order to resume it with greater fury. As soon as his arrangements were made, he opened it with violence. The batteries of the Étoile, those of Johannesburg, Kabrun, Schelmühle, Langfort, fire rounds upon rounds and overwhelm us with shells, rockets, and red-hot balls. Fires break out, the edifices are falling to ruins. Dantzic presents the appearance of a volcano whose eruptions issue forth, disappear, and again show themselves in every direction. The two banks of the Motla, the Buttermark, the Poggenful, the Speicher Insel, all are destroyed. In vain do the troops run to their assistance. An unintermitting shower of projectiles triumphs over their efforts, and a loss of several millions aggravates the misfortunes of this wretched population. Our forts and our villages were not in a better condition. Ora, in particular, was nothing but a heap of ashes. 5 batteries were blazing against it without intermission. Clouds of riflemen, sheltered by the inequalities of the ground, overwhelmed us with shot and impeded the working of our guns. The first entrenchment, almost annihilated by fire and balls, still held out. Major Schneider defended it with a degree of valor and prudence which still promised a long resistance. But it was on the point of being taken by approaches, and I gave it up. I also relinquished the head of Schidlitz. The enemy had tried some days before to make themselves masters of it. 3 companies had presented themselves before our posts, but being vigorously charged by Captain Leclerc and Lieutenant Kowalski, they were routed and sought their safety in flight. This lesson was not thrown away. The Allies returned with more considerable forces and established themselves there. A very serious accident befell us soon after. A shell burst in a magazine of wood and set it on fire. Powder is not quicker. In an instant, everything is in a blaze. The flames, propagated by a strong wind, spread themselves from point to point, and present a heap of fire which no effort can extinguish. A sad spectator of so cruel a disaster, I hoped at least to save the distant buildings. My expectation was still deceived, and we had the misfortune to see the greatest part of our provisions consumed before our eyes. Officers and soldiers, all were plunged in mournful silence. All beheld with amazement this scene of desolation, when of a sudden a terrible discharge of musketry is heard. The enemy were attacking the lines of Friaul and were getting possession of them. Captain Chambord flies to their relief. This valiant officer commanded a chosen troop called the Free Company, or the Enfants Perdus. He rushes into the redoubt and cuts the Russians in pieces. Not a man escapes. Those who avoid the bayonet perish under the fire of the chiefs of the battalion, Clauron and Debowski. Lieutenant Conrad gives a proof on this occasion of singular firmness. With a shoulder fractured by a ball, he throws himself into the thickest of the fight. Chambord extricates him. "You are wounded." He said to him, "This is no longer a place for you. Go and announce to the general that we are in the redoubt." "Captain," replied the intrepid lieutenant, "I have still my right hand. You have only your left," and he continues to fight. Defeated on the left, our assailants throw themselves on the right and drive us back as far as our forts. I did not judge it right to resume the attack in a dark night. I waited till the next day. 2 columns, commanded by Generals Breisau and Devilliers, marched at the same time on Stolzenberg and Schidlitz. The Russians occupied them in force, but our troops fought with so much zeal. Major Desker, the chiefs of the battalions, Poniatowski, Krikakowski, and Carre, Captains Farabeck, Perrin, Kalisa, and Ruzin, led them on with so much skill and valor that the Allies were broken and left the field of battle heaped with their dead. Unfortunately, our success was dearly bought. General Breisau, so estimable for his talents and courage, was dangerously wounded. In vain all the aid of art was lavished on him. He expired after a month of acute suffering. Our troops were victorious, but what a spectacle awaited them within the fortress. Rubbish and ruins were the only remains of our magazines. One alone had escaped the fury of the flames. Indebted for its preservation to Colonel Cotton and the second in command of the staff Marquesac, it had only been secured by dint of their zeal and perseverance. The chief of squadron Turkheim, who had also given so many proofs of zeal, and Lieutenant Fleurs had also succeeded in saving 4,000 quintals of corn. All the rest was in flames. Everything else had perished. We did not preserve 2 months' provisions, which the flames, continually more active, and an unceasing bombardment threatened with destruction. The Russians advanced slowly, but yet they advanced. They had got possession of different posts and marched in mass on Stolzenberg. Too weak to offer an effectual resistance, our soldiers had evacuated it. General Hussein assembled a few troops and sounded the charge. It took place with remarkable impetuosity. Captain Milcent and Adjutant Major Revel moved forwards at the head of some of our bravest soldiers, came up with the enemy, and defeated him. Captain Chambora was preparing a more severe lesson for our assailants. He embarked in a dark night, deceived the vigilance of the fleet, and landed opposite to Bonesack. He surprises the village, sets fire to the habitations and magazines, slaughters the men and horses, and returns to his boats. They were no longer on the shore. The trumpets were sounding, the call to arms was heard, death appeared inevitable. Nevertheless, he does not lose courage. He calms the soldiers, throws himself across the enemy's entrenchments, and arrives safe and sound at the moment it was thought he was destroyed. He soon begins another march and proceeds to Brozen. He falls unexpectedly on the troops which occupy it, defeats them, and does not retire till he has burnt their camp. Scarcely has he returned when he rushes upon a more perilous enterprise. He penetrates into the enemy's trenches, defeats and drives in their posts, and returns to shelter himself behind our batteries. Lieutenant Jamabon, seriously wounded at the beginning of the attack, fought as if he had not been affected by the pain. It was so acute that the fear alone of discouraging the soldiers was capable of stifling his groans. He died 5 days afterwards. Honor be to his memory. The Free Company became every day more audacious. Trenches, palisados, were trifling obstacles. It penetrated everywhere. In the middle of a dark night, it stole along from tree to tree, the whole length of the avenue of Langfort, without being perceived by the Russians. On a sudden, it leaped into their works, killed some of the Russians, drove out the others, and pursued them as far as Cabrun. The brave Suramont, the intrepid Rosé, Payen, Dizot, Gonapet, and Francoeur threw themselves on the redoubt and carried it. 100 men were put to the sword, the others owed their escape only to flight. We carried on with our besiegers a war of surprise and bravery. They combated us by stratagems and proclamations. Their batteries were unceasing, and our magazines were destroyed. Our troops, wasted and harassed by labor and want of sleep, had nothing to renew their strength but a little bread and an ounce of the flesh of our horses, if we might give that name to the wretched skeletons of animals, which, rejected by the cavalry and wagon train, had turned the mill, till being unable to stand any longer, they were led to the slaughterhouses. It was to men so fatigued with fighting and suffering that the Russians promised repose and abundance. Every attempt to decoy them was used. Gold, silver, threats, the anger of their sovereigns, the voice of their country, were offered and invoked. The Duke assisted his emissaries. He wrote, entreated, protested, assailed officers and soldiers. Desertion began to prevail among our foreign troops. They even refused to do any duty. The Bavarians, the Poles themselves, too well acquainted with our misfortunes, feared to make a sacrilegious use of their arms, and remained in a state of inaction. We were reduced to our mere national troops, that is to say, to less than 6,000 men, and we had an extent of more than 2 leagues to defend. I resolved to inform the Emperor of this painful situation. This was not an easy task. All Germany was in a state of insurrection. The sea was covered with the enemy's squadrons. But no dangers, no obstacles, deterred Captain Marnier. He undertook this adventurous expedition, captured a vessel, sailed along with the English fleet, and escaped from it. The Duke of Württemberg attempted to seduce every one. I was not myself free from his attempts. He exalted his resources, depreciated mine, spoke of France, of Siberia, and proposed to me to give up the fortress. His threats and his offers were addressed to a wrong quarter. I convinced him of this, and I heard no more of them. More suitable means were brought into play. The fires were increased, and the bombardment, continually growing more furious, was kept up night and day. The town, the Bischberg, the redoubts of Friaul were battered to pieces. Supported by so tremendous a fire of artillery, the Russians expected to carry us by assault. They advanced provided with hatchets and ladders, and rushed on the Guden battery. Captain Razumsky commanded it. He received them with discharges of grape shot and overthrew them. They nevertheless rallied and attempted an escalade, but overpowered by a destructive firing, they dispersed at the sight of Major Desker and left their arms and ladders in the possession of the valiant Captains Zabuski and Propaki. They attempted, with as little success, to make themselves masters of the Pfitzer battery in the avenue of Langfort. Colonel Plessman, Captain Renouard, and Adjutant Stoling made a resistance which they could not overcome. 3 times they returned to the charge, as often are they defeated. The redoubts of Friaul were meanwhile in a deplorable condition. Without parapets and mines, overwhelmed by shell and grape shot, they presented no means of defense. I ordered them to be deserted. The greatest part of the fortifications was still untouched, but our provisions were approaching to their termination. The season when the ice appears was arrived. 20,000 men would have been necessary for me to withstand the progress of the besiegers, to guard the forts, to secure the inundation, and to keep the course of the water free. The contest was too unequal. To have continued the defense would merely have been to spill blood for the pleasure of spilling it. I conceived I had found a plan which was consistent both with my duty and with humanity. I calculated the number of days that the remainder of our provisions would last us. I proposed to suspend hostilities and to surrender the fortress at the end of that term, if the course of affairs did not alter the arrangement. Negotiation began. The firing ceased. General Houdelet and Colonel Richemont went to the enemy's camp and concluded a capitulation in which the power of returning to France was particularly guaranteed to us. A part of the articles had been already executed. The Russian prisoners had been sent back. The forts had been given up, when I learnt that the Emperor Alexander refused his ratification. The Duke of Württemberg offered me to put things in their former condition. This was a mockery. But what could we do? We had no more provisions. It was necessary to be resigned. He managed things as he wished, and we took the road to Russia. Affected by our misfortunes, our allies wished to have suffered them in common with us. The Poles broke their arms in pieces. The Bavarians swore never to turn them against us. But duty bids the affections be silent. It became necessary to separate. General Prince de Radziwill and Colonel Butler, both so distinguished by their character and by their achievements, led them back to their country. Thus ended, after 1 year's fighting, a defense in which we had to encounter every calamity and every obstacle. A defense which is not one of the least proofs of what the courage and patriotism of French soldiers are able to effect.
Chapter 44.
We were conducted to Kiow. We were there informed of the prodigies performed by that handful of brave men who had not despaired of the safety of their country. They had triumphed at Montmirail, at Cézanne, at Champaubert, in every part where the enemy had dared to await them. All Europe fled before them. The coalition was dissolved. The obstinacy of a soldier snatched from us the fruits of victory. It became necessary to fight and conquer again, but ammunition failed us. The corps did not arrive. The generals were haranguing the troops to make them capitulate. Everything was lost. Our glory, our conquests vanished as a shadow. Even the signs of them were repudiated. The end of the coalition was attained. Our captivity was no longer profitable. We were set at liberty. We returned to France. What a spectacle did she present! The body of emigrants had invaded the army and the antechambers. They were bending under the ensigns of command and decorations. The first person that I met at the Tuileries was a chief of a battalion, whom I had formerly assisted and protected. He was become lieutenant general. He did not know me again. Another, who was with me a long time at Dantzic, had not a better memory. This last person I had received at the recommendation of the Duc de Cador. I had experienced his sickening adulations. He used to style me Monseigneur. Your Excellency, he would willingly have called me the Eternal. In proportion as I told him how much these fooleries displeased me, he increased them. He even conceived the idea of attending at my levee. If it had depended on him, I must have conceived myself a sovereign. His malversations delivered me from this obstinate flatterer. They became so glaring that the government was on the point of proceeding against him. I saved this gentleman from the shame of punishment. but I made him retire. He went to exercise his industry at. He soon became acquainted with our reverses, was alarmed, took post, and never stopped till he was on this side of the Rhine. His fear had served him better than courage could have done. He had large epaulets and 4 or 5 decorations. This was well for the opening of his career. Promotion does not go on so quickly on the field of battle. He withdrew as soon as he saw me. Apparently his costume embarrassed him. I met a third, who also did not feel quite at ease in my presence. Formerly attached to Josephine, he had given proof of a truly exquisite foresight, in order to be provided against all unforeseen cases which might occur in promenades and journeys. He had provided himself with a silver gilt vessel. When a circumstance required it, he drew it from his pocket, presented it, took it, emptied it, wiped it, and put it away with care. This showed the very instinct of domesticity. But all these worthies, so ardent for the treasury, for decorations and commands, soon showed the amount of their courage. Napoleon appeared. They were eclipsed. They had flocked to Louis XVIII, the dispenser of favors, but they had not a trigger to pull for Louis XVIII in misfortune. We tried a few dispositions, but the people, the soldiers, had never been accomplices of the humiliations of France. They refused to fight against the colors that they adored, and the emperor peaceably resumed the reins of government. Generals Bertrand and Memoirs wrote to me to come to the Tuileries. I returned to Paris. A new invitation was waiting for me at my hotel. The Grand Marshal informed me that His Majesty wished to see me. I did not like to keep him waiting. I went just as I was, quite sure that Napoleon would know how to appreciate duty and affection. I was introduced immediately. Napoleon. You are there, Monsieur General Rapp? You have been much wanted. Whence do you come? Rapp. From Equin, where I have left my troops at the disposal of the Minister of War. Napoleon. Did you really intend to fight against me? Rapp. Yes, sire. Napoleon. The devil. Rapp. The determination was compulsory. Napoleon, in an animated tone. I was very well aware that you were before me. If an engagement had taken place, I would have sought you out on the field of battle. I would have shown you the head of Medusa. Would you have dared to fire at me? Rapp. Undoubtedly, my duty, Napoleon. This is going too far. But the soldiers would not have obeyed you. They have preserved more affection for me. Besides, if you had fired a single shot, your peasants of Alsace would have stoned you. Rapp. You will agree, sire, that the situation was a very painful one. You abdicate. You leave us. You engage us to serve the king. You return. All the power of old recollections cannot deceive us. Napoleon. How is that? What do you mean to say? Do you think that I have returned without alliance, without an agreement? Moreover, my system is changed. No more war, no more conquests. I wish to reign in peace and promote the welfare of my subjects. Rapp. You are pleased to say so, but your antechambers are already full of those flatterers who have always encouraged your inclination for arms. Napoleon. Bah, bah. Did you often go to the Tuileries? Rapp. Sometimes, sire. Napoleon. How did those folks behave to you? Rapp. I have no reason to complain of them. Napoleon. The king appears to have received you well on your return from Russia? Rapp. Quite so, sire. Napoleon. Without doubt. Cajoled first, then sent about your business. This is what would have befallen you all, for after all, you were not their men. You could not suit them. Other titles, other rights were necessary to please them. Rapp. The king delivered France from the Allies. Napoleon. Very true, but at what price, and his engagements, has he kept them? Why did he not hang Ferrand for his speech on the national domains? It is the insolence of the nobles and priests, which made me leave the island of Elba. I might have come with 3 millions of peasants who ran to me to tell their grievances and offer their services, but I was certain of not finding resistance in my way to Paris. The Bourbons are very fortunate that I have returned. Without me, they would at last have had a dreadful revolution. Have you read Chateaubriand's pamphlet, which does not even allow me courage on the field of battle? Have you not sometimes seen me stand fire? Am I a coward? Rapp. I have felt, in common with all honorable men, indignation at an accusation as unjust as it is mean. Napoleon. Did you sometimes see the Duc d'Orleans? Rapp. I only saw him once. Napoleon. He is the only one who has discretion and tact. The others have bad men about them and are very ill-advised. They do not like me. They will now be more furious than ever. There is good reason for it. I am arrived without striking a blow. They are now about to cry me down as ambitious. That is their eternal reproach. They have nothing else to say. Rapp. They are not the only persons who accuse you of ambition. Napoleon. How am I ambitious? When people are ambitious, are they as fat as I am? He struck his stomach with both hands. Rapp. Your Majesty jokes, Napoleon. No, I have wished that France should be what she ought to be, but I have never been ambitious. Besides, what do these folks think of? It becomes them well to assume importance with the nation and the army. Is it their courage on which they pride themselves, Rapp? They have occasionally shown some, in the army of Condé, for instance. Napoleon. What is that order that I see on you, Rapp? The Legion of Honor. Napoleon. The devil. They have had, however, the sense to make a handsome decoration of it. And these two crosses here? He touched them. Rapp. St. Louis and the Lily. He smiled. Napoleon. What do you think of that? Berthier, who did not like to remain. He will return. I forgive him all. On one condition, however, it is that he will wear his garde du corps uniform to appear before me. But enough of this. Well, General Rapp, we must serve France once more, and we shall rescue ourselves from the condition in which we are. Rapp. Confess, sire, since you have had the goodness sometimes to permit me to speak to you freely, confess that you were wrong in not making peace at Dresden. Everything was repaired if you had concluded it. Do you recollect my reports on the spirit of Germany? You treated them as pamphlets. You blamed me. Napoleon. I could not make peace at Dresden. The Allies were not sincere. Besides, if everyone had done his duty at the renewal of hostilities, I should again have been the master of the world. I had already gained to my side 32,000 Austrians. Rapp. It is only a moment since your Majesty had no ambition, and now we hear again of the sovereignty of the world. Napoleon. Ah, well, that's true. Besides Marmont, the senators, my plan was arranged so as not to let a single ally escape. Rapp. All these misfortunes are the consequence of the reverses at Leipzig. You might have prevented them by accepting peace at Dresden. Napoleon. You are ignorant what such a peace would have been. And suddenly growing warm. Would you be afraid to go to war again? You, who have been my aide-de-camp for 15 years? On your return from Egypt, at the death of Dantzic, you were nothing but a soldier. I have made a man of you. Now you may pretend to anything. Rapp. I have never let slip any opportunity of showing my gratitude to you for it, and if I am yet alive, it is not my fault. Napoleon. I shall never forget your conduct in the retreat from Moscow. Ney and you are of that small number who have the soul thoroughly well-tempered. Besides, at your siege of Dantzic, you did more than impossibilities. Napoleon fell on my neck and pressed me with vehemence against him for at least 2 minutes. He embraced me several times and said to me, pulling my mustachios, Come, come, a hero of Egypt and Austerlitz can never forsake me. You shall take the command of the army of the Rhine, while I treat with the Austrians and Russians. I hope that, in a month's time, you will receive my wife and son at Strasbourg. It is my pleasure that from this evening you perform the duty of my aide-de-camp. Write to Count Maison to come to embrace me. He is a brave man. I wish to see him. Napoleon related a part of this conversation to some persons about him. He told them that I had spoken to him with too great liberty and that he had pulled my ears. Fortune smiled on him. The courtiers came round him in multitudes. It was enthusiasm, devotion. They boiled with zeal. These protestations had not, however, all the effect they had promised themselves. Many were rejected. One particularly, who persisted in obtruding his services, was repulsed with severity. Loaded with favors, gold, and dignities, he had overwhelmed his unfortunate benefactor with insults. He was treated with loathing and contempt. These gentlemen boast at present of an incorruptible fidelity. They find fault with the indulgence of the king in the saloons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. They would like to see all those who were employed during the 100 days led to the scaffold. Chance has served them. Appearances are for them. Let it be so. But the generals, the ministers of Napoleon, the officers attached to his person, know full well what to think of these stoics of the antechamber. Sooner or later, the royal government will be enlightened. There is wherewithal to supply the place of the Red Book. Napoleon sent for me on the 29th of March, and informed me that I must set out for the army of the Rhine. He gave me the Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor, which he had destined for me after the siege of Dantzic. He told me that within 15 days my forces should be raised to 40,000 men. I had 15,000 at the commencement of hostilities. I observed to him that this was very little in comparison with those that we were going to have on our hands, that the Congress, its declaration was already known, threatened us with a deluge of soldiers. "The declaration you allude to is false," he replied angrily. "It was fabricated at Paris. However, go. Lecourbe will command in Franche-Comté, Suchet in the Alps, Clausel on the Garonne. We have great chance of success. Girard goes to Metz. He has just tormented me to give him that Bourmont. I yielded to him with regret. I never liked that man's countenance." The propositions I have made to the sovereigns have been coldly received. Nevertheless, all hopes of arrangement are not destroyed. It is possible that the energy with which opinion is pronounced may incline them to sentiments of peace. I am going to make another attempt. This is the letter that I write to them. "Sir, my brother, you will have learnt in the course of the last month my return to the coasts of France, my entry into Paris, and the departure of the family of the Bourbons. The true nature of these events must already be known to your Majesty. They are the work of an irresistible power, the work of the unanimous wish of a great nation which knows its duties and its rights. The dynasty, which force restored to the French people, was not made for them. The Bourbons have not consented to link themselves either to their opinions or their manners. France had a right to separate herself from them. Her voice called for a liberator. The hope which prompted me on to the greatest of sacrifices had been deceived. I came, and from the point at which I reached the shore, the love of my people has borne me even to the bosom of my capital. The first wish of my heart is to repay so much kindness by the maintenance of an honorable peace. The re-establishment of the imperial throne was necessary for the happiness of the French. My most earnest wish is to render it, at the same time, useful to the consolidation of the repose of Europe. Enough glory has shone by turns around the colors of different nations. The vicissitudes of fortune have often enough made great calamities follow great successes. A finer arena is open today to sovereigns, and I am the first to descend into it. After having presented to the world the spectacle of great combats, it will be more pleasant henceforth to know no other rivalry than that of the advantages of peace, and no other struggle than the holy contest whose people shall be most happy. France hastens to proclaim with frankness this noble end of her wishes. Jealous of her own independence, the invariable principle of her policy will be the most unbounded respect for the independence of other nations. If, happily, such are, as I trust they are, the personal sentiments of your Majesty, a general calm is secured for a long time, and justice seated on the confines of the different states will suffice alone to guard their frontiers. I am with esteem, etc. But all overtures were useless. He was above human stature. He secured the supremacy of France. This was the grievance which nothing could counterbalance. I was convinced of it. His destruction was resolved on. I set out for Alsace. The hostile attitude of foreign courts had excited general indignation in that province. All generous minds, all who abhor a foreign yoke, were preparing themselves to repulse this league of kings who, under pretext of fighting with one man, only sought to enrich themselves with our spoils. The inhabitants, by concert and by a spontaneous movement, had rushed to the heights which command the defiles, to the roads or passages, and labored at the construction of entrenchments. Women and children put their hands to the work. They diverted and animated each other by singing patriotic songs. There was between all the citizens a rivalry in zeal and devotion. Some raised redoubts, others cast balls, mounted old muskets, and fitted the cartouches. In fine, every hand was in movement, everyone wished to labor in the common defense. An affecting scene, and worthy of ancient times, took place at Mulhausen when I arrived there. A ball was given, the most distinguished persons of the town were met, the assembly was brilliant and numerous. Towards the close of the evening, war and invasion of the territory were talked of. Every one communicated his advice, every one told his hopes and his fears. The ladies were talking together and conversed on the dangers of their country. On a sudden, one of the youngest proposed to her companions that they should swear never to marry any Frenchman who had not defended the frontiers. Cries of joy, clapping of hands, resounded from every part of the room. The looks of all present were directed towards the ladies. The rest of the company came up and crowded round them. I went with the throng. I applauded this generous proposal. I had the honor of administering the oath, which every one of the fair patriots came to receive at my hands. This trait recalls the marriage of the Samnites, but it has something perhaps still more admirable in it. That which was an institution among the people in question was with us the effect of a spontaneous resolution. With them, patriotism was in the law. With us, it was in the hearts of our fair countrywomen.
Chapter 45.
All this zeal, however, did not fill up my ranks. The time was passing away, and the recruits did not come in. The Allies formed themselves in corps on the left bank of the river. They could cross at any time. My situation was become very critical. I communicated to the Emperor the accounts of my number and situation. He could not conceal his surprise. So few men, Alsace, the patriotism of which is so ardent. No matter, victory will soon raise battalions. There is nothing to despair of. War has its chances. We shall get through it. Napoleon had ordered me 4 days before not to leave a single soldier of the line in the fortified places, to take from the depots all who were in a condition to serve, to inundate and make good the lines of Weissenburg, and to keep up carefully my communications with Bitch. I was engaged in these measures, but he found that I did not proceed with sufficient celerity. He wrote to me, Monsieur General Rapp, I have received your letter of the 12th of May. I see by the statement you have annexed that the 18th Regiment of the line, of which your army has 2 battalions, 1,200 men strong, can furnish you with a 3rd battalion of 600 men. Order it to set off immediately from Strasbourg to join you. The 32nd can only supply a reinforcement of 200 men to your active battalions, which will raise them to 1,200 men. The 39th and 55th can furnish you their 3rd battalions. Order them to join you. The 58th can furnish you with 200 men to make its 2 battalions complete. The 103rd can complete its 2 first battalions to 1,200 men. The 104th, the same. The 7th Light Regiment can furnish you with its 3rd battalion. In the same manner, the 10th Light Regiment. You can then, with a little activity, reinforce your infantry with 4,000 men. I am surprised that there has not been more voluntary enlistment in Alsace for these regiments. The 39th of the line is recruited in the Upper Rhine. That department ought at least to have furnished 2,000 veteran troops, which, divided between the 39th, 32nd, and 18th, ought to raise the 3rd and even the 4th battalions to their full numbers. The 10th Light, which is recruiting in Upper Saône, ought to receive many recruits. The 57th, which is recruiting in the Doubs, ought also to receive a great number. The 7th Light, the 58th, and the 104th, which recruit in the Lower Rhine, ought to be complete. Inform me for what reason all the men that you have at your depots are not immediately clothed and do not fill up your ranks. Let me also know what men are announced for these regiments from the different departments. Do you expect that by the 1st of June your 3rd battalions will be complete, and that each regiment will amount to 1,800 men, which will make 7,000 men for each of your divisions? Are you satisfied with the generals of division and of brigade under your command? What will be the condition of the 2nd Chasseurs, the 7th and 19th Dragoons, all of which have their depots in your division? By the 1st of June? These 3 regiments had at their depot 400 men and 300 horses. They must have received an increase since. By the 1st of June, with active measures, this division ought to have 1,500 horse. The 3rd Division has also all its depots in your arrondissement. It has 1,200 men at its depot. It ought then to furnish you with 2,000 horses. Paris, May 14, 1815. Napoleon. I immediately replied to the questions which he had put to me. I explained to him the deplorable state into which the army had fallen. Arms, horses, clothing, It was necessary to have everything renewed. I could not have more than 22,000 men at my disposal by the 1st of June. The picture was not brilliant, but the emperor made so admirable an use of his resources that we were never justified in despairing. He put fresh funds at my disposal. He stimulated my zeal, begged me to neglect nothing to increase my forces, and to reconnoiter all the defiles. His dispatch deserves to be known. Count Rapp, I received your letter of the 18th of May. I have allotted 13 million francs for clothing in the distribution of May. Orders for considerable sums have been sent to each corps of your army. Be assured that they will be paid. I cannot reconcile to my mind that you will not be able to have at your disposal, by the 1st of June, more than 22,000 men, when the force at the depot is 4,000 men. Send for the 3rd Battalion of the 18th Regiment, the 3rd of the 39th, the 3rd of the 57th, the 3rd of the 7th Light, the 4th of the 10th Light, which will raise you 1 regiment of 4 battalions, 4 of 3 battalions, and 4 of 2 battalions, or 24 battalions in all. Hasten the clothing. Money is in the course of being transmitted to you, and will not be wanting. The enumeration of your cavalry, which you have sent me, is not correct. How is it that the 6th Cuirassiers has only its 3rd and 4th squadrons at the depot? What is then become of its 5th squadron? The same observation for the 19th Dragoons. You have 1,787 men and only 427 horses. But you do not inform me how many men there are in detachment to take the horses of the gendarmes, how many there are to be remounted at the depot of Versailles, how many horses the regiment is to receive from the contracts it has made, or how many the departments are to furnish. If you are sufficiently active, you ought soon to have 1,500 or 1,600 of these 1,700 men mounted, which, joined to those now composing the squadrons, will increase your cavalry to near 4,000 men. You look at these matters too lightly. Remove the obstacles by your own exertions. See the depots and augment your army. Keep spies on the lookout to know what is passing on the other side of the Rhine, and principally at Mentz and Thionville, and make yourself acquainted with all the openings of the Vosges. Napoleon. Paris, May 20th, 1815.
Chapter 46.
I went to occupy the lines of the Lauter. 23 years before we had defended them, but then they were in a good condition. The left bank of the river was protected. We had 80,000 fighting men, a corps of reserve, and the army of the Upper Rhine assisted us. Nothing of that sort existed now. The lines were merely a heap of ruins. The banks and the sluices, which formed their principal strength, were nearly destroyed, and the places which supported them were neither armed nor even secure against a coup de main. We scarcely reckoned 15,000 infantry, which were divided into 3 divisions under the orders of Generals Rotembourg, Alba, and Grandjean. 2,000 horse, under Count Merlin, composed all our cavalry. From Weissenberg as far as Hunningen on one side and to Belgium on the other, the frontiers were completely unprotected. In this state of things, Germersheim became an important position. Defended by a considerable garrison and 24 pieces of cannon, it could not be carried but by main force. I despaired not of success, and I made, as soon as the news of hostilities reached me, a general reconnaissance, in which I got possession of Haun, of Auweier, and of all the villages of the Queich. The chief of squadron Turkheim took at a gallop that of Gottenstein and the Bavarian detachments which occupied it. On the 21st, towards midnight, all the arrangements were made, and the columns of attack were already in march when news of the disaster of Waterloo was announced. The columns were immediately recalled. I well knew that the enemy would lose no time in crossing the river. I hastened to take the administrative measures that circumstances required, and to put in a state of defense the fortresses which were under my command. I threw a battalion of the line into Landau, whither I ordered the treasuries of the country to be removed. But already, as I had foreseen, the troops of the coalition had passed the Rhine at Oppenheim and at Germersheim, and had spread themselves in every direction. Our soldiers were obliged to fight their way in order to arrive at their destination. We retreated behind the Lauter. and the rumor of the invasion of the Upper Rhine by the Grand Army under the command of Schwarzenberg having reached me at the same time, I dispatched, post-haste, 2 battalions to reinforce the garrisons of Neuf-Brisach and of Schlestadt. The Russians, Austrians, Bavarians, Württembergers, Badeners, and a multitude from other nations assembled to the number of more than 60,000 men, under the orders of the Prince Royal, now King of Württemberg, soon outfronted the feeble corps under my command. I had first determined to defend Alsace foot by foot, retiring towards the Vosges, the Meurthe, the Moselle, and the Marne. But I learnt that the army of the Moselle, which supported me on my left, had marched towards the north, that the enemy's columns already occupied Saarbrück and inundated Lorraine. This movement then was no longer practicable. On the other hand, a hasty decision in such an unexpected juncture might be attended with the most serious consequences. I temporized in hopes of receiving orders to regulate my movements, but after the dispatch which informed me of our misfortunes, I did not receive another till the entry of Louis XVIII into Paris. In the evening of the 24th, the Württemberg cavalry attacked my advanced posts. The chasseurs of the 7th and the dragoons of the 11th took arms, rushed on the enemy, and cut them in pieces. The next day, the army continued its movement of concentration. I fixed my quarters in advance of the forest of Hagenau, the right of the army at Seltz, the center at Surbourg, and the left, being my cavalry, on the road to Bitch, which the enemy had already invested. This position was only a temporary one. It was too extended. I only took it to avoid retiring suddenly behind the town, and thus allowing the enemy to penetrate between that place and Saverne, which Lieutenant General Debarau occupied with a battalion of the line, some partisans, and a few lancers. General Rodenburg was entrusted with the task of observing the Rhine on our rear and on the right. I had only been able to allow him a brigade, which I had left at Seltz. Out of this, I was obliged to withdraw the 40th Regiment the moment the Austrians appeared. There only remained with him the 39th, whose 2nd Battalion formed the advanced posts and the reserve. The 1st, a company of sappers and 8 pieces of cannon, composed the line of battle for more than half a league of ground. The situation, without being bad in itself, had nothing particularly encouraging in it. The small town of Seltz, supported on the Rhine, is situated on the 2 banks of the Seltzbach. This river is pretty secure for about 400 yards, but farther up it is fordable everywhere, and the woods on its banks render the passage of it still more easy. On the other hand, I feared a landing which the enemy could easily effect behind the right, and to which I could make but a feeble opposition, whilst all my attention was wanted to the front, which, as I have said, extended to a great distance. In this alternative, General Rodenburg decided on keeping a watch on the Rhine only by means of patrols, and he sent a company to guard the fords from the mill at Seltz to Niederödern. He placed his artillery on a small eminence on the right bank, to the left of the town, and what remained of his soldiers he sent forward to support the 2nd Battalion, which occupied the advanced posts and the wood. At 11 o'clock the enemy, having assembled his masses, commenced the attack by a well-sustained fire of musketry, which he supported with 8 pieces of cannon. The opposition of our troops was obstinate, and for a long time was effectual, but at last this small advanced post was compelled to retreat into the wood. It maintained itself there with heroic courage, and resisted for a long time the efforts of from 8 to 9,000 men, aided by a numerous artillery. In fine, after a few hours of the finest resistance, this handful of valiant troops retreated in the greatest order and rejoined the 1st Battalion. Emboldened by this success, our adversaries brought down their masses. They debouched by the main road and marched on Seltz, of which they thought to get possession without difficulty. We allowed them to come up under the fire of our batteries. As soon as they could play, a tremendous discharge carried death into their ranks. Encouraged by their numbers, they nevertheless continued to advance, and the combat recommenced with more vigor than before. But, constantly repelled by the valor of our soldiers and mowed down by the French artillery, the Austrians in the end gave way and retired in confusion into the wood. Their movements from that time became uncertain, and they hesitated a long time what they should do. Our cannon continued to carry destruction into their ranks. Attack was not more dangerous than inaction. They again advanced, and succeeded in getting possession of the part of the town situated on the left bank. But this triumph cost them dear. A few shells, thrown on the houses of which they were in possession, compelled them to leave them, and to regain, in a great hurry, their first place of shelter. Our batteries fired with increased fury, and the fugitives suffered an immense loss. This was not the only attack in which they failed. At the commencement of the action, they had advanced by the main road from Weissenburg to Hagenau on Surburg, which was occupied by a battalion of the 18th under the command of Colonel Voyrall. This village was valiantly defended. For more than 2 hours, the enemy could not penetrate into it, but they at last brought up forces so considerable that under the apprehension of seeing the position turned, General Albert ordered it to be evacuated. Our soldiers withdrew behind the Saar, where they joined the remainder of the regiment. Attacked in this position by some chosen troops of the Austrian army, they remained immovable. Wearied with so many fruitless attacks, and convinced that they could not succeed in forcing men who appeared determined to die at their post, nor in getting possession of the avenues of the forest, the Allies at last decided on retreating. We had 300 men killed and wounded. The Austrians, by their own account, had lost 2,000 men and had 2 pieces of cannon dismounted. Our troops had scarcely taken a few hours' rest when I was obliged to put them again on their march. The Allied army of the Upper Rhine was advancing on Strasbourg. I had received this news during the action. I had not a moment to lose. I marched immediately towards that place, and the result has shown whether this measure was proper.
Chapter 47.
It was during this retreat that the soldiers heard of the disastrous Battle of Waterloo and the Emperor's abdication, which, to that moment, I had carefully concealed from them. These events produced an universal discouragement, and desertion soon found its way among them. Fatal projects entered the minds even of those who were least carried away by passion. Excited by malevolence, some wished to return to their homes. Others proposed to throw themselves as partisans into the Vosges. I was immediately informed of these intentions. I directly foresaw what terrible consequences they might produce. I issued an order of the day. It succeeded. Their minds were tranquilized, but it was not long before anxiety revived. When we reached Hagenau, the regiment, formerly so illustrious, loudly proclaimed the design of quitting the army and of repairing with its artillery into the mountains. The cannon were already harnessed, and 1 battalion had taken up its arms. I was informed of it. I rushed to the spot. I took in my hand the eagle of the rebels, and placing myself in the midst of them, "Soldiers," I cried, "I learn that it is proposed among you to desert us. In an hour's time we shall fight. Do you wish the Austrians to think that you have fled from the field of honor? Let the braves swear never to quit their eagles or their general-in-chief. I grant permission to the cowards to depart." At these words, all exclaimed, "Long live Rapp! Long live our general!" Everyone swore to die by his standard, and tranquility was restored. We immediately began our march and reached the Suffel, 2 leagues in advance of Strasbourg. The 15th Division had its right on the river Ill, its center at Hohenheim, its left at Suffel-Weiersheim, and extended to the road from Brumpt. The 16th occupied Lampertheim, Mundelsheim, the 3 villages of Hausbergen, with its left resting on the road from Saverne. Lastly, the 17th was in columns on the road from Molsheim, with 2 regiments of cavalry. 2 others were placed in the rear of the 15th Division at Bischheim. Such was the situation of our troops on the morning of the 28th, when the enemy attacked with impetuosity the village of Lampertheim, which was occupied by a battalion of the 10th, under the command of General Berman. This battalion alone sustained for a long time the attacks of 8,000 infantry and the continued firing of 6 pieces of cannon. However, as the number of the assailants was continually increasing, it withdrew behind the river and, conformably to its orders, stationed itself at Mundelsheim. The enemy's columns, from 40 to 50,000 men strong, advanced immediately by the roads from Brumpt and Bischweiler. All these arrangements, and the masses of cavalry which covered the first of these roads, announced that their project was to separate the divisions of Generals Rodenburg and Albert in order to overwhelm the latter. I did not mistake the design of the Allies, but I had not the power of uniting my troops, which had deployed in an immense plain and were already engaged throughout the whole line. There only remained one expedient. I adopted it immediately. Fortunately, it was a most fatal one for the enemy. I closed the 10th Regiment into columns in the very midst of the firing. I ordered the 32nd to advance, and I moved it en echelon after having formed it into a square. The rest of the division of Albert remained in reserve on the height of Hitterhausbergen. Defending the ground foot by foot, General Rodenburg changed the front of his division, throwing his left wing into the rear, and proceeded to cover the villages of Hohenheim, Bischheim, and Schittigheim, threatening the flank of the troops which were engaged between these two divisions. This was according to his orders. The 103rd was placed on the road from Brumpt, and the 36th left Suffel-Weiersheim to support it, but scarcely had it begun to march when the Allies attacked the village. I immediately dispatched a company to defend this important position. Our soldiers advanced to it, running, but our adversaries had taken possession of it before they could arrive. Captain Chauvin supported with extraordinary courage the fire of a cloud of sharpshooters, and thus gave time for General Fririon to come up. This officer left a battalion and 4 pieces of cannon to cover the road, and advanced in charging time with the rest of his forces. General Gudin seconded this movement and maneuvered on the road from Bischweiler. The Austrians gave way and withdrew, but the reinforcements which they every moment received left our troops no chance of maintaining their position. On the other hand, the assailants had outflanked the 10th, and the moment had arrived for effecting the movement which I had ordered. Consequently, the 16th Division wheeled back its left wing perpendicularly to the rear, while it preserved the head of Hohenheim, from whence our artillery raked the enemy in flank and rear. At the same time, the gallant General Bormann, attacked on every side and already surrounded, sallied forth from Mundelsheim at the head of the 10th and retreated without disorder towards the division. The Austrians on their side advanced on the road from Brumpt with enormous masses of cavalry and infantry, supported by a formidable artillery. They penetrated between the two divisions and arrived without obstacle on 4 pieces of cannon, which had been continually pouring discharges of grape shot on their columns. They were taken, but the enemy presented his flank to the troops of General Rodenburg and to 2 regiments of cavalry which were on his front. I took advantage of this circumstance, put myself at the head of the 11th Dragoons and the 7th Horse Chasseurs. I made a rapid charge. I routed the first line, penetrated the second, and overthrew everything that offered me any resistance. We made a dreadful slaughter of the Austrian and Württemberg cavalry. At the same time, the 32nd came up at the charge in close columns and prevented them from rallying. They were thrown back on their own infantry, whom they put to flight. General Rodenburg, on his side, pushed forward his right wing and opened on the enemy, who defiled in confusion before his columns, a most destructive fire of artillery and musketry. In an instant, the field of battle is covered with the slain, and the immense army of the Prince of Württemberg is routed. The defeat was so complete that baggage, which was 2 leagues in the rear, was attacked and plundered, and the prince himself lost his equipages. The confusion extended itself as far as Hagenau, and would have gone still farther if 30,000 Russians, who came up from Weissenburg, had not by their presence encouraged the fugitives. The night which came on, and the risk that there would have been in adventuring against forces so superior to our own, prevented us from profiting by our successes. We could not retake our artillery. The enemy had made haste to remove it to his rear. It cost him very dear to keep it. He had from 1,500 to 2,000 men killed and a still more considerable number wounded. On our side, there were about 700 killed and wounded. Of this number were 2 captains of light artillery, Favier and Dandlau, both wounded in defending their cannon, and Colonel Montagnier, who performed such signal service on this occasion. The enemy's general revenged himself for this defeat by devastation. The day after the battle, he set on fire the village of Suffelweiersheim under pretext that the peasants had fired on his troops. This was not the fact, and the name of the Prince of Württemberg will remain forever sullied by an action which plunged a multitude of families into misery. Whether the vigor with which we had repulsed all their attacks had given them a distaste for making new ones, or from some other motive, our adversaries remained some days without undertaking anything. I took advantage of this repose to provision Strasbourg and to fortify myself in my positions. I also had time to give to all commanders of places who were under my command the most precise instructions. Meantime, the Allied army continued to increase. Fresh corps arrived every day to swell its numbers. Very soon, 70,000 men deployed before us and pressed us on every side. Flags of truce came one after the other, without having any marked object in view. I proposed to the enemy's general a suspension of arms, during which I might send an officer to Paris and receive orders from the government. The Prince of Württemberg refused, without, however, renouncing the system of communication that he had adopted. It was about this time that he sent for the pastor of Wendenheim, a respectable man and an excellent patriot. "Are you acquainted," he said to him, "with General Rapp?" "Yes, my lord." "Will you undertake a mission to him?" "Assuredly, if its object is in no respect contrary to the interests of my country." "Well then, go, and tell him that if he will deliver up Strasbourg to me for the King of France, wealth and honors shall be showered on him." "My lord, General Rapp is an Alsatian, and consequently a good Frenchman. Never will he consent to dishonor his military career. I consequently beseech your highness to entrust someone else with this message." At these words, the venerable pastor bowed and departed, leaving the prince astonished and confused at having proposed in vain this piece of meanness. Nevertheless, his highness was not discouraged. On the 3rd of June, he dispatched General Vaquant to me with a flag of truce to demand of me in the name of the King of France the surrender of Strasbourg. In order to inspire more confidence, the Austrian officer wore an enormous white riband and the decoration of the lily. I asked him whether he came from the king. He replied that he did not. "Well then," I said to him, "I will not give up the place till my soldiers shall have eaten the thighs of Austrians, as those I had at Dantzic ate those of Russians." Importuned by the insignificant communications which the commander of the Allied forces was every day sending me, I endeavored to penetrate into his motives. With this object, a general reconnaissance was made on the 6th on the Austrian positions. Our soldiers took some posts of cavalry, cut others to pieces, and returned to the camp after having made all the enemy's army get under arms. Having heard, 2 days after, a heavy cannonade in the direction of Pfalzburg, I resolved to make a second reconnaissance, as well to make myself precisely acquainted with the forces that I had before me, as to hinder the Prince of Württemberg from detaching troops against that place. Albert's division and the cavalry marched against the entrenched camp, which the Austrians had formed all the way from the strong position of Oberhausbergen to Heiderhausbergen. The attack commenced at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was impetuous and crowned with the most complete success. The enemy's cavalry were repulsed and put to flight by the brigade of General Gravel. The principal villages were taken at the point of the bayonet, and the entrenchments carried by force. Several officers were taken in their beds, and others at the very moment they were rushing to arms. Some generals escaped in their shirts, and owed their safety only to the darkness which protected them. The 10th Light Infantry, commanded by the gallant Colonel Crétet, displayed in this affair the same valor as at the Battle of the 28th. The 18th, under the orders of Colonel Voirol, one of the most intrepid officers in the French army, made itself master of the village of Mittelhausbergen, where he withstood for a long time numerous forces and incessant attacks on every point. The signal for retreat having been given, General Albert ordered the 57th to form in echelon towards the attack on the right, and the 32nd towards that on the left. We retired in the best order. The enemy endeavored to disturb us. He attacked our troops. The 57th received him without wavering and opened a fire at musket length which disorganized his columns. Twice the Allied cavalry returned to the charge. Twice was it repulsed with loss. General Laroche, who led it on, was wounded and fell under the feet of the horses. He would have perished if the French had not come to his assistance. "Friends," cried he, "I once served in your ranks. Save me." He was immediately taken up and restored to his own men. A troop of cuirassiers had nearly surprised the 18th in its retrograde movement, but the chief of the staff, Colonel Schneider, having skillfully opposed to it a battalion that he had by him, broke their shock and saved the regiment from an inevitable defeat. The Allies, convinced that they could not succeed in cutting us off, left us peaceably to continue our march. Our troops returned to their camp, after having accurately ascertained the immense superiority of the forces that they had to contend with. Both parties entered into cantonments. A military convention was signed a few days afterwards, and hostilities ceased throughout all Alsace.
Chapter 48.
Inactivity soon engendered sedition. Other armies, other corps, which had not the excuse of being misled by a political combination, had trampled underfoot military discipline. Is it strange that, in the midst of the general effervescence, my soldiers should for a moment have forgotten themselves? This episode is painful to me. I ought neither to write it nor omit it. I can well bear the blame which Joubert, Massena, and so many other generals, whom I do not pretend to equal, have incurred. The following are the terms in which this act of disobedience is related by an anonymous writer. He has not thought proper to tell everything, but it is my own conduct that is concerned. I must imitate his reserve. I submit, moreover, to the judgment which he has delivered. The Austrians, despairing of ever getting possession of Strasbourg by force of arms, endeavored to form an understanding with a party in the town. They succeeded by their sagacity in the application of the two means which act the most powerfully on the heart of men, gold and terror. They decoyed some by the attraction of riches. They subdued others by making them dread the vengeance of the government. When they were in this manner assured of all those whom they thought open to seduction, they hastened to execute their perfidious designs. From the commencement of the campaign, our soldiers had been in a state of irritation, well calculated to promote the secret views of the enemy. They were acquainted with the disastrous affair of Waterloo. They knew all the details of it, but they had too much confidence in the skill of that celebrated man, with whom they had 5 times triumphed over all Europe. They had too often seen him, by sudden inspirations, regain his hold of victory when she was escaping from him, to believe that his military genius had on the sudden abandoned him. They were perpetually thinking of this disaster, and they could never think of it without rage. Persuaded as they were that our troops had continued the same, and that they had to do with the same enemies, such a defeat appeared to them inconceivable. Not knowing the true cause of it, they attributed all our misfortunes to treason. Traitors had given intelligence of our plans. Traitors had commanded false maneuvers. Traitors had raised the cry of sauve qui peut. There were traitors among the generals, among the officers, among the soldiers, and who knew whether there were none but in the army of the North? Who knew whether the corps of which they were a part, their regiment, their company, were not infested with them? Could they reckon on their chiefs, on their comrades? Everyone was suspected. It was necessary to distrust everyone. Such was the language in which anger found vent, which malevolence caught up, magnified, envenomed, and which every soldier in the end repeated and believed. This idea soon became the medium through which everything was explained. Accustomed to keep the field, they saw themselves with pain compelled to retreat before an enemy whom they despised. It would have been natural to attribute his progress to an immense numerical superiority. They chose to explain it otherwise. Their chiefs were in correspondence with the Austrians. Several circumstances, as unfortunate as they were unavoidable, concurred to give to this opinion an appearance of probability in the prejudiced eyes of these soldiers. The first of these was the order which General Rapp received to disband the army and to dismiss each soldier separately, without money and without arms. The next was an injunction sent to him by the government to deliver to the Russian commissioners 10,000 muskets taken from the arsenal at Strasbourg. These two dispatches obliged him to enter into a correspondence with the Allies. The frequent interchange of messengers which took place on this occasion produced a bad effect on their minds. The mystery which the general was obliged to observe to conceal from the troops the removal of the firearms increased the irritation. Malevolence raised it to its height. It was loudly said that Count Rapp had sold himself, that he had received several millions of francs from the Austrians to introduce them into the fortress, and that if he discharged the soldiers individually and without arms, it was in consequence of an agreement to deliver them up to the enemy. As soon as these seeds of discontent had been once sown in the different corps, they were developed of themselves. The instigators had nothing more to do than to observe their progress, to combine the incidents calculated to augment the disorders, and to render inevitable the catastrophe which they were preparing. Although General Rapp was far from suspecting such a plot, he had taken, in some way, all the measures that he could take to frustrate it. As soon as the ministerial dispatch relative to the disbanding the troops reached him, he had dispatched with all speed to Paris one of his aides-de-camp, the chief of squadron, Marnier. This officer saw the ministers repeatedly and represented to them into what violence the army would be led if the whole amount of the pay due to it was not discharged, but he could only obtain, notwithstanding the most earnest solicitations, a bill for 400,000 francs on the chest of the War Department. His return with this trifling sum destroyed all the hopes that had been excited. The general-in-chief, who saw the troops getting more and more exasperated, left nothing untried to allay the storm. The want of money was the principal cause of dissatisfaction. To put an end to this source of discontent, Count Rapp endeavored to raise a loan in Strasbourg. The inhabitants having demanded of him a security, he solicited from the Minister of Finance authority to pledge the stores of tobacco in the town. The minister refused it. Nevertheless, by the interposition of General Semalet, who commanded the fortress, a sum of 160,000 francs was obtained. Such slight supplies could not satisfy the soldiers, who were inflamed by false reports, and among whom the insurrection was not slow in breaking out. It was sudden and general, and presented a character quite peculiar. I will enter into all the details of it, because they will serve to make the spirit of the French soldiery better known. On the 2nd of September, about 8 in the morning, about 60 subaltern officers of different regiments met in one of the bastions of the place. They agreed on a plan of obedience to the orders for the disbanding of the army, but on conditions from which they resolved not to swerve. This declaration began in the following manner. In the name of the Army of the Rhine, the officers, sub-officers, and soldiers will obey the orders issued for the disbanding of the army only on the following conditions. Article 1. The officers, sub-officers, and soldiers will not leave the army till they have received all the pay that is due to them. Article 2. They will set out all on the same day, carrying their arms, baggage, and 50 cartridges each, etc., etc. As soon as this document was drawn up, they repaired to the general-in-chief to communicate it to him. The general, who was at the time unwell, was taking a bath. Astonished at this unexpected visit, he gave orders that they should be admitted. 5 officers immediately entered the bathing room. They explained the object of their mission and declared that the army would not submit to be disbanded till those conditions should have been fulfilled. At the word conditions, the general in a rage sprang out of the bath, and tearing the paper out of the hands of the speaker, cried, "What, sirs, do you wish to impose conditions on me? You refuse to obey. Conditions on me." The tone of his voice, the look of Count Rapp, and perhaps the attitude in which he presented himself, struck the deputation. It retired in confusion, and each of the officers returned to give an account to his regiment of the bad reception they had met with. The sub-officers, who were assembled to the number of about 500, were waiting for the general's answer. They clearly perceived, when they were made acquainted with it, that such a man was not easily intimidated, and that they were not likely to be more successful in such an attempt than their chiefs. But their determination was taken. They came and ranged themselves in line of battle in the palace yard, and demanded to be introduced to the general-in-chief. An aide-de-camp came down to know the purpose which brought them there. They refused to enter into any explanation with him. "Who is the chief of the troop?" asked the officer. "No one. Every one," they all replied together. He called into the center of the court the oldest of each regiment. He remonstrated with them on the act of disobedience that they were rendering themselves guilty of. 1,000 voices at once interrupted him. "Money! Money! We will be paid what is due to us. We know how to get ourselves paid." The chief of the staff, Colonel Schneider, whose courage they had so often admired in the midst of danger, arrived at this conjuncture and endeavored, but with as little success, to quiet them. "Money," they again repeated, "money." Wearied with uttering their cries and holding out useless threats, and not being able to get at the general-in-chief, they dispersed after having fixed on a rendezvous. The greatest part went to the parade, where they immediately proceeded to the election of the new chiefs whom they had determined on having. One of them, called Dalhousie, sergeant in the 7th Light Regiment, well known for his ability, his courage, and particularly for a soldier-like oratory which was peculiar to him, was unanimously elected. "You want to be paid," he said to his comrades, "and it is for this that you are here." "Yes," they replied with a common voice. "Well then, if you will promise to obey me, and to abstain from all confusion, to respect property, to protect persons, I swear by my head that you shall be paid within 24 hours. This speech was received with cries of joy, and the sergeant was appointed general. He immediately chose for the chief of the staff the drum major of the 58th. A second sub-officer was charged with the office of governor of the fortress, a third with the command of the 1st Division, another with that of the 2nd, and so on. The regiments had colonels, the battalions and squadrons chiefs, and the companies captains. In short, a complete staff was formed. The other sub-officers had returned to the barracks, where the soldiers were waiting with impatience for the result of the step that had been taken. The drum was immediately beat to arms, and all the corps, infantry, cavalry, and artillery marched in order and in double-quick time to the parade. The organization was scarcely ended when they arrived there. As soon as they appeared, the new chiefs went and took command, and marched the troops to the points they had orders to occupy. In the meantime, General Rapp, astonished to see so serious an insurrection break out, had dressed himself in haste, in hopes of ascertaining the motives of these seditious movements, and of succeeding in quieting them. But the different operations of which we have just given an account had been effected with such celerity that at the moment when he set out, accompanied by his adjutant general and a few officers, several columns, followed by a numerous populace, were already debouching through all the streets leading from the square of the palace. As soon as they perceived the general, the troops hastily put themselves in order of battle, and charged bayonets to hinder him from passing. Immediately furious cries were heard in the rear ranks. "Fire! He has sold the army! Fire, then!" Some wretches, scattered among the troops, excited them by their gestures and voices to massacre this brave man. Rage spread from man to man, and confusion was soon at its height. The soldiers, enraged, loaded their muskets. The ranks were doubled. 8 pieces of cannon arrived at a gallop, and were immediately loaded with grape-shot. Every time that General Rapp addressed those who menaced him, vociferations commenced, and irritating cries were uttered with increased violence. Muskets were repeatedly leveled at him, and the pieces of cannon were constantly directed against his person, and the gunners followed all his movements. "Stand aside," they exclaimed, "that we may fire on him." A howitzer was constantly kept so directly pointed at the group which surrounded the general that he perceived it. He ran to the cannoneer who was holding the match. "Well, what would you do, wretched man?" he said to him. "Do you wish to kill me? Fire then, here I am at the mouth of your gun." "Ah, General," the soldier exclaimed, letting the match fall from his hand. "I was at the siege of Dantzic with you. I would give you my life, but my comrades will be paid, and I am obliged to do as they do," and he resumed his match. Wearied with senseless questions, with appeals without any object, deafened by the clamors of the multitude, the mass of which was continually increasing, the general decided at last on returning to the palace. The troops followed him, and the different avenues were immediately occupied by 8 pieces of cannon, 1,000 infantry, and a squadron of cavalry. This guard called itself the exterior guard of the palace. A battalion came and established itself in the court and took the name of Interior Guard. Nearly 60 sentinels were placed in pairs at all the gates and on the staircase which led to the apartment of Count Rapp. There were also some for a few moments at the door of his bedchamber. The telegraph and the mint were immediately taken possession of. To show that they had no bad designs, a detachment was sent to the hotel of the Austrian General Volkmann, who was in the place, and was put at his disposal. The drawbridges were raised, and there was no communication with anyone out of the fortress without a permission signed by the new commander. The drum major of the 58th repaired with a trumpet to the headquarters of the Allies and signified to them that if they respected the truce, the garrison would not commit any act of hostility, but that if they endeavored to take advantage of the misunderstanding which existed between the chief and the soldiers, it would know how to oppose a noble resistance. Meanwhile, Dalhousie had established his staff at the parade and had appointed 2 commissions, the one for the provisions, composed of quartermaster sergeants, and the other for the finances, composed of sergeant majors. They constituted themselves permanent, deliberated on the measures best calculated to maintain the public tranquility and to put the town in a state of security against surprise. The posts of the citadel and those of the interior were doubled. Guards were even placed at some old posterns, which, till then, had been neglected. The outer line was strengthened. The troops bivouacked in the squares and in the streets. In fact, no precaution was omitted which the most suspicious prudence could suggest. In order to prevent the excesses to which malevolence might excite the soldiers, it was forbidden, under pain of death, to enter any of the places where brandy, wine, or beer was sold. The same punishment was denounced against all who should be guilty of plunder, riot, or insubordination. Lastly, still better to secure the public tranquility, it was resolved that the army should be informed of its situation every 6 hours. These arrangements having been made, the Receiver General and the Inspector of Reviews were sent for. The latter made a calculation of the sums necessary for the present year's pay. The other presented the account of what he had in the chest. After which, Dalhousie convoked the town council, to whom he declared the motives which had made the garrison take arms, and requested the mayor to take means to get funds necessary to pay the arrears. He then dispatched to Count Rapp a deputation, composed of the new governor and of 5 or 6 general sergeants. "Well, what do you want of me again?" cried the general in a tone of indignation and contempt. "You are unworthy to wear the French uniform. I believed that you were men of honor. I am deceived. You allow yourselves to be seduced by wretches. What do you wish to do? Why do these guards surround the palace? Why is this artillery pointed against me? Am I then so formidable? Is it believed that I wish to escape? Why should I escape? I fear nothing. I do not fear you. But to the point, what do you want of me?" He repeated this question. The agitation of Count Rapp while pronouncing these words was a striking contrast to the melancholy air of the deputation. These sub-officers, ashamed of keeping a chief whom they loved and whose valor and fidelity were so well known to them, a prisoner, kept a profound silence. They were on the point of withdrawing, when one of them spoke. "General," he said, "we have learned that the other corps of the army have been paid. Our soldiers also are resolved to be paid. They are in a state of revolt, but they obey us. We only ask what is due to us, the slight indemnification for so much blood and so many wounds. We only ask for what is indispensable to enable us to perform our march and withdraw to our homes. The troops will not return to order. It is a thing firmly resolved on until everyone be paid." "There is not enough money in the chest," replied the general. "It was my intention to have you paid, stoppages and all. I dispatched an aide-de-camp to Paris. He saw the ministers, but they could only give him 400,000 francs. It is this sum, together with that in the chest of the paymaster, which I will order to be divided among the different regiments. The army will be paid, my general. I have told you all that I have to say to you. Withdraw and return as soon as possible to order." If the enemy unfortunately should be acquainted with what is going on here, what will become of you? All this has been foreseen, my general. A regiment of cavalry and 12 pieces of cannon have set out to reinforce the division which is at the camp. It is easy for you to get us paid, and you have everything to fear on the part of the soldiers if in 24 hours from this time their request is not complied with. What is it to me what you and your soldiers may do? I repeat that you shall only have the funds which are destined for you. Do not hope that whatever happens, you can compel me to do what my duty prohibits. General, the soldiers can conduct you to the citadel. They can even shoot you. We answer for them now, but if you do not cause us to be paid, I have nothing more to say to you. Quit my house. If you shoot me, so be it. I prefer death to shame. You are the enemies of order. You are the instruments of malevolence and of a conspiracy which you yourselves are not acquainted with. The enemy perhaps is in concert. I make you responsible for everything that may happen. You have heard me. Begone. I am ashamed to converse with rebels. The word conspiracy made a very deep impression upon them. They remained silent for some time. They began again, however, and one of them said that if there were among them any who had secret intentions, they were ignorant of it, that for themselves they only wanted their pay, but that paid they would be, and that they were going to bring to him the civil authorities in order that he might give directions for raising the funds, after which they withdrew. Whilst the council was consulting on the means of securing public tranquility and of liquidating the pay in arrear, the army had effected different movements. It had marched and countermarched, always at a running pace, without uttering a word, without venting a threat against the officers whom it had put under arrest. This silence, rather extraordinary for French soldiers, had something sinister about it, at which the inhabitants were alarmed. Nevertheless, the troops at last became calm, but they held no communication with the townspeople. They even refused to answer their questions. In the streets, in the squares, groups were continually seen forming, which dispersed after they had communicated in a very low tone either orders or opinions. The whole town was plunged in melancholy disquietude. Fatal epochs were recalled to their recollection. They feared to see them revive. Everyone trembled for his property, for his life. Never was there a more terrifying scene than that which this large city then presented. The general-in-chief, having learned that the inhabitants had consented to raise the necessary funds, and that they yielded to fear what they had for so long a time refused to his entreaties, dispatched the adjutant general to the civil authorities to settle with them about the distribution of the loan. This officer was conducted to the town hall by a corporal and 6 men who did not quit him. He finished his accounts and returned to the palace under the same escort. In the meantime, the generals and chiefs of corps employed in turn threats and entreaties to bring back the mutineers to their duty. The men, who loved their superiors and who would not have dared to fail in duty before their faces, had recourse to artifice to escape from the ascendancy and the representations which they dreaded. When an officer went in one direction, care was taken to oppose to him in the front rank soldiers of a different corps and description, and while he harangued these, the others vociferated from behind. If, in spite of this tactic, he succeeded in getting at one of his own men, and reproached him, "Me, my officer," the other replied with hypocritical mildness, "I am not doing anything, I am not speaking a word," and he immediately buried himself in the crowd. The troops soon adopted a general measure to free themselves from these importunate solicitations, and all those who had any important command were ordered to keep to their homes. The alarms of the citizens were soon tranquilized. The retreat was sounded a long time before night, and from that moment patrols succeeded one another without interruption. Several orders of the day were read at each post. They recommended tranquility and obedience, and promised that the payments should be made within 24 hours. One of these orders was thus worded: "Everything is going on well, the inhabitants are raising the money, and the payments have begun." Signed, Garrison. The town was ordered to be illuminated, in order that it might be more easy to keep up a strict watch. The secret instigators of the insurrection did not fail to perceive that a degree of wisdom presided in all the councils which rendered their case desperate, that their end was baffled if they did not succeed in again inflaming the minds of the soldiery and in exciting some commotion in which blood might be spilt. With this view, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a horse chasseur arrived at full gallop on the parade, announcing that 3 wagons full of gold had just been stopped belonging to General Rapp, who was sending them out of the city under the protection of the Austrians. "These 3 wagons," he added, "have been taken to the covered bridge, and here is the receipt I am bearing to our commander-in-chief. General Rapp must be shot. He is a traitor. He has sold us to the enemy." Whatever irritation still remained, this speech produced little effect. The troops used their chief roughly to compel him to levy contributions, but they did not entertain any suspicion against him. His reputation as a man of honor remained unblemished, and his integrity was no more doubted by them than his courage. Such open provocations to murder excited distrust, and the soldiers became more circumspect. Some, however, propagated alarms and wished that his person should be secured, but the army had the good sense to repel suggestions the complete perfidiousness of which it did not perhaps at first perceive. As soon as one expedient failed, the conspirators attempted another, and left nothing untried to spill blood, persuaded that if it had once flowed, it would be easy to make it flow again. The general's coachman was driving from the palace to the stables a cart laden with straw. The sentinels made some objections to allow it to pass. It, however, went on, but scarcely was it out when some ill-disposed persons cried, "Treason," and pretended that under the pretext of removing straw, the military chest was carried off. Immediately, the multitude rushed on the cart and on its load in order to search it the better. Nothing was found. They loaded it again, demanding nevertheless that it should go back. The horses took fright, set off, and ran over a child. At this sight, fury redoubled. The guards were forced. The multitude rushed tumultuously into the court of the palace, seized the coachman, and massacred him without pity in the hands of an officer who had come forth to defend him. The disorder was not meant to stop at the death of a servant, but groups of soldiers came up, forced the most infuriated to restrain themselves, and thus the blow once more failed. All the attempts to get General Rapp massacred by the hands of his troops having failed, recourse was had to extraordinary means of assassinating him. As soon as night was come, a multitude of individuals succeeded each other and used force to introduce themselves into his bedchamber. But the aides-de-camp and some officers defended the door with courage and preserved their chief from insult. In the midst of this effervescence, an event suddenly happened to cool the soldiery and contributed to restore them to order. The enemy's line drew its cantonments closer round the town at the very moment the insurrection broke out, and also received considerable reinforcements. This coincidence of the measures adopted by the Austrians with an event which they ought not to have been acquainted with gave much room for conjecture. Thus, the outer division immediately doubled their main guards. Fresh troops and artillery came from the town. The enemy, intimidated, durst not make any attempt. Perhaps he was also awaiting the result of the plots which he had framed in Strasbourg. Perhaps he feared to enter into an engagement with an army so much the more formidable as it had put itself under the necessity of conquering, and as it continued, for all that related to the military arrangements, to receive its orders from General Rotemburg, whose courage and skill the Austrians had experienced more than once during this campaign. The enemy, therefore, remained in position and appeared to be waiting till the favorable moment should arrive. On its side, the army was on its guard against the tricks prepared for it, and pursued with calmness and firmness the only end which it had in view, the discharge of the pay in arrear. General Garrison redoubled his vigilance to preserve public tranquility, and went forth attended by his staff, all dressed in their uniform and on horseback, to secure the execution of his orders. As soon as he appeared, the drums beat to arms, the guards were turned out, and rendered him all the honors due to a commander-in-chief. Thus Strasbourg presented the appearance of the most perfect order in the midst of disorder, and the most severe discipline reigned in an army in a state of revolt. The loan having been raised, the pay officers, according to the numerical order of the regiments, were conducted under a good escort to the paymaster general, where they received the sums necessary for the pay of their corps. But they were enjoined not to make any individual payments until all the regiments should have received what was owing to them. Thus passed the first day. There was less agitation on the second. Still, there was an attempt to make the troops believe some rumors calculated to produce disturbance, but little attention was paid to them. Towards evening, the orders given to the sentinels of the palace became less strict. The aides-de-camp had leave to go out under escort. A file of grenadiers was appointed to escort them where they wished and to conduct them back again. During the night, the posts were all renewed. Individuals, in the uniform of sub-officers, presented themselves once more to penetrate into the general's apartments, to satisfy themselves, as they said, that he had not escaped. The altercations between them and the officers of the staff were warmer than ever. The latter, nevertheless, in the end prevailed. In fine, the division of the funds was effected towards 9 o'clock in the morning. Immediately, the call to arms was sounded. The army assembled, withdrew its posts, raised the siege of the palace, and repaired to the parade. General Garrison, accompanied by all his staff, drew up the troops in line and addressed to them the following proclamation. We give it verbatim. Soldiers of the Army of the Rhine, the bold step which has just been taken by your sub-officers to obtain justice and the complete discharge of your pay has compromised them with the civil and military authorities. It is in your good conduct, your resignation, and your excellent discipline that they hope to find safety. That which you have maintained up to the present time is the best guarantee of it, and of this they hope for a continuance. Soldiers, the pay officers have in their possession all that is owing to you. The garrison will return to its former situation. The posts will remain till the general-in-chief shall have given orders in consequence. On their return from the parade, the sergeant-majors and quartermasters shall repair to their pay officers, and shall take note before paying the troops from Monsieur the colonels, in order to keep back what is not due. The infantry is to be disbanded. It will take superior orders, and the cavalry, still having no order, will wait its lot in order to give up, at least before setting off, the horses, arms, and all that belongs to the government, in order that it may be said they are Frenchmen. They have served with honor, they have obtained payment of what was due to them, and have submitted to the orders of the king under the glorious title of the Army of the Rhine. By order of the Army of the Rhine. The Sergeant General, after having delivered this speech, which the army heard in silence, made the two divisions of infantry, the cavalry and artillery, defile before him, and went in great pomp to display at the offices of the prefect and mayor the white flags that had been made by his orders. The troops then returned to their barracks and submitted themselves to the authority of their respective officers. As soon as they were restored to liberty, the generals, colonels, and superior officers were anxious to repair to Count Rapp, to express to him the pain they had experienced at seeing the army thus unmindful of the reign of discipline. They even caused a protest against the seditious movements which the army had given way to be printed, which they all signed, and which contained expressions very flattering to the general-in-chief. 2 days after, they laid down their arms at the arsenal, and all the corps were disbanded. Dalhousie, as leader of the revolt, had incurred the penalty of death, but he was pardoned on account of the good order that he had maintained in the midst of the insurrection. The army was dissolved. My command having expired, there was nothing to keep me any longer in Alsace. But the good souls of the Faubourg Saint-Germain had imagined that we were a source of terror to Europe. On the field of battle, I believe we were, and the Allies did not disallow it. In other respects, this was thinking too highly of us. With regard to plots and conspiracies, it is not we who deserved the palm. I, nevertheless, went to meet that which they wished to allot to me. I wrote to the king. I did not attempt to disguise my sentiments from him. If I had been able to throw the whole coalition into the Rhine, I would have done it. I did not conceal it. My letter was thus worded. Sire, I do not endeavor to justify my conduct. Your Majesty knows that the bent of my mind and my military education have always led me to defend the French territory against all foreign aggression, I could not, above all, hesitate to offer my life in defense of Alsace, which gave me birth. If I have preserved the esteem of your Majesty, I desire to finish my career in my own country. If it were otherwise, I should be the first to demand to go and pass my days abroad. I could not live in my country without the esteem of my sovereign. I only ask this. I have need of nothing more. This letter was of use. Marks of regard that had escaped the monarch kept malevolence within bounds. I passed some months at Paris without being disturbed, but the race of emigrants had filled the chambers and harangued at the tribune. Their vociferations against all the men distinguished for their talent and courage whom France can boast of gave me such a disgust that I withdrew. I went into Switzerland, where at least aristocracy did not present the scandalous spectacle of the rage of the present time, combined with the meanness of the past. The ordinance of the 5th of September was issued a short time afterwards. I returned to Paris, where I live quietly in the bosom of my family, and where I have experienced happiness which till then was unknown to me.
Here the memoirs terminate. We will only add a few words. Become a member of the House of Peers, the general was called into the presence of the king. This favor did not make him unfaithful to old recollections. So many immortal days were too deeply engraved in his mind. He could not forget our victories, or him who had conducted them, or those who had obtained them. He had often taken so glorious a part in them. Courage does not disinherit herself. In like manner, the brave soldiers who were persecuted by men whom they had eclipsed on the field of battle always found in their general a devoted protector. His purse, his credit were open to them. Never did he repel the unfortunate. Those who had none of the privileges which the standard gives participated in his benefits. It was sufficient if they were in distress. Misfortune was something sacred in his eyes, the state of inactivity into which on a sudden he had fallen after a life of alarms and fatigue hastened to a fatal termination the wounds with which he was covered. His health was gone. He soon ended the term assigned him by nature. He beheld death without emotion, ordered himself to be put in a position so as to front the enemy, whom he had always looked in the face, and expired, offering up his prayers for France and his family.
This concludes the Memoirs of General Rapp, presented by Major Intonio. We hope you've enjoyed this volume. For further, similar audiobooks, visit the Major's YouTube channel or our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.